Have you ever felt like the whole world is pushing you to believe something that doesn't quite add up? That's exactly how I feel about electric cars. Everywhere you look, the media is hyping them up as the ultimate solution to save the planet. But what if I told you there's undeniable proof that it's all a carefully crafted illusion? Electric vehicles have come a long way, and it's fascinating when you look back at how it all started. Believe it or not, EVs aren't some shiny new idea that popped up in the 21st century. They've actually been around for over a century. Back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, electric cars were competing with gas-powered vehicles for dominance.
And of course now, they're having meetings in Italy. A lot of their stuff's in Italy. Listen to this. The company is pledging to expand output and protect jobs in return for manufacturing conditions and government support for the industry.
At the time, EVs were seen as cleaner, quieter, and easier to use because you didn't have to crank them up like gas cars. In fact, in the early 1900s, about 1/3 of all vehicles on the road in the US were electric cars. However, as gasoline became cheaper and more widely available, and as gas cars improved in speed and range, EVs fell out of favor. It wasn't until the 1970s, with the oil crisis and growing concerns about pollution, that the idea of electric cars started to make a comeback. Fast forward to today, and it's clear EVs are no longer just a niche product. They've become a global phenomenon. If you look around, you'll notice more Teslas, Nissan Leafs, and Chevy Bolts on the road than ever before. Why? A big reason is the push for cleaner energy and a desire to reduce carbon emissions. Governments around the world are stepping in with incentives to make EVs more affordable.
Well, government backing yet again. They want to make relationships between them and their dealers and things better, blah, blah, blah. How about making cars that don't cost too much, that don't fall apart? You make crappy cars, Stellantis, and they cost too much money. And that's why people aren't buying the stupid things.
In the US, for example, you can get tax credits for buying an electric car, and many states offer additional perks like rebates or access to carpool lanes. Europe is even more aggressive, with countries like Norway planning to phase out gas-powered cars entirely in the next decade. This combo of environmental concerns and financial incentives is making EVs more attractive to a wider audience. And then there's the companies leading the charge, pun intended. Tesla's the first name that comes to mind for most people, and for good reason. They didn't just make EVs mainstream, they made them cool. The Model S, with its insane acceleration and cutting-edge tech, changed the way people think about electric cars. But Tesla isn't the only player in the game. Nissan was a pioneer with the Leaf, and one of the most affordable mass-market EVs. Chevrolet followed suit with the Bolt, which offered impressive range at a reasonable price. Now you've got companies like Ford entering the race with their electric F-150 and Mustang Mach-E, while startups like Rivian and Lucid are aiming for luxury and adventure markets. Even traditional giants like Volkswagen and Toyota are pouring billions into EV development. They're not perfect, and plenty of people have valid criticisms. One big issue that comes up a lot is their environmental impact. Kind of ironic, right? EVs are marketed as being green and eco-friendly, right? But I'm afraid it's a bit more complicated than that. A lot of people don't realize that making an EV, especially the battery, has a pretty significant carbon footprint. Mining for materials like lithium, cobalt, and nickel can be environmentally destructive and energy intensive. Plus, these materials often come from countries with questionable labor practices. And then there's the manufacturing process itself, which uses a lot of energy. Sure, once you're driving an EV, it doesn't produce tailpipe emissions. But if the electricity you're charging it with comes from coal or gas, you're still contributing to pollution. There's also an ongoing debate about whether EVs really have a lower overall carbon footprint compared to the traditional gas cars when you consider their entire life cycle, from production to disposal. Then there's the money side of things. Let's not sugarcoat it, EVs can be expensive. The upfront cost is still higher than that of many gas-powered cars, even with government incentives. You might be thinking, okay, but I'll save on gas and maintenance, right? And yeah, EVs are generally cheaper to maintain since they have fewer moving parts and don't need oil changes. But the savings on fuel and maintenance might not be as huge as you expect, depending on how much you drive and where you live. Electricity costs can vary, and if you need to install a home charging station, there's an extra expense. Plus, replacing the battery, if it ever comes to that, can be incredibly pricey, like several $1,000s pricey. Another big sticking point for people is practicality. Let's talk about range anxiety. If you ever worry about your phone dying when you're out and about, imagine feeling that way about your car. Even though EV ranges have improved a lot, many people are still nervous about running out of charge, especially on long trips. And while charging stations are becoming more common, they're still nowhere near as widespread or convenient as gas stations. Depending on where you live, finding a charger can feel like searching for a needle in a haystack. And even if you do find one, charging an EV takes time, much longer than it takes to fill up a gas tank. Even with fast chargers, you're looking at 20 to 30 minutes for a decent charge, which can feel like an eternity if you're in a hurry. If you've been paying attention to the news or scrolling through social media, you've probably noticed that electric vehicles can get a lot of airtime. But what's really interesting is how differently they're portrayed depending on where you look. It's almost like there are two completely opposite stories being told. On a brighter side, EVs are often hyped as the future of transportation. You'll see headlines about how they're helping to combat climate change, reduce air pollution, and make cities quieter and cleaner.
And having better relationships between the manufacturers, Stellantis, and their various dealerships around the world, that ain't gonna solve problems. They're still selling expensive crap. And it doesn't matter how many times they rename it, it isn't fixing the bottom line problem, which is they don't make very good vehicles.
Articles and videos often showcase the latest technological advancements, like longer battery ranges, faster charging, or even futuristic self-driving features. And of course, there are profiles of companies like Tesla, which has become practically synonymous with the EV revolution. Tesla's flashy launches and Elon Musk's bold statements make for great stories. It's not just Tesla though. Brands like Rivian, Lucid Motors, and even traditional automakers like Ford and Volkswagen are getting their moment in the spotlight, with journalists praising their efforts to adapt to a greener future. Honestly, this kind of coverage makes EVs sound like they're going to save the world. But then you have the negative coverage, and it's just as loud. Remember the Chevy Bolt recall over battery fires? Stories like that grab headlines, and they can make EVs sound like a risky gamble. You'll also see reports about EVs breaking down, struggling in cold weather, or having issues with charging infrastructure. And let's not forget the debates over government subsidies. Critics often argue that too much taxpayer money is being funneled into EV incentives or charging networks, questioning whether this money can be better spent elsewhere. Sometimes these critiques can make it seem like EVs are being propped up artificially rather than succeeding on their own merits. Then there's a whole issue of bias, which can get pretty murky. Some people believe that media coverage of EVs, whether positive or negative, is influenced by who's paying for the ads. Think about it. Traditional car companies spend a ton of money on advertising, so it's not crazy to wonder if that affects how much scrutiny they get versus newer EV companies. On the flip side, some argue that certain outlets lean too heavily into promoting EVs because it fits a broader narrative about sustainability and innovation. It's a tricky balance, and it makes you question whether the media is giving us the full picture or just the angle that suits their financial or ideological interests. Investigating whether electric vehicles qualify as a scam requires understanding what that term really means: intentional deception for personal gain. When we dig into the evidence, it's clear EVs don't fit this definition. Studies show that while there are valid concerns about battery production and infrastructure, EVs generally offer lifetime emissions compared to gas-powered cars. Consumer reports reveal high satisfaction rates among EV owners, who often praise the cost savings on fuel and maintenance. Experts and advocates argue that these vehicles are a necessary step toward a greener future, and there are countless success stories of cities adopting to EVs to reduce pollution and improve transportation. While challenges exist, labeling EVs as a scam oversimplifies a complex and evolving history. So what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.